Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of True Crime with Caitlyn. Today we're going to be discussing a case that devastated Manchester and still haunts the city today. 54 years ago, a young girl was walking home from a concert when she was barbarically murdered and her killer is still out there, many people believing that she was the victim of a serial killer. This is the unsolved murder of Dorothy Leyden. Dorothy Leyden was born in the mid-1950s in Harpurhey, Manchester. She was the oldest of 7 children and was a brilliant role model who they all looked up to. They would even describe her as being like a mother figure. Dorothy was described as a shy girl, but as she grew older, she really came into herself. She had a love for fashion, and any spare money that she had from working, she would either spend that on clothes or on music. And Dorothy would even make some of her own garments too, which her younger siblings thought was absolutely fantastic. Along with her love for fashion, she was interested in all things beauty, hair, makeup, the lot. She was a typical teenage girl. In April 1971, Dorothy was 17 years old, and I can imagine she was counting down the days till the 24th. She and a handful of her friends had managed to get tickets to see American soul singer Jimmy Ruffin, tickets which they probably paid about 50 pence for. Jimmy was a very popular Motown artist, and everyone who listened to music knew his song What Becomes of the Brokenhearted, which I'm not going to try and sing because I'll shatter all of the glass around yous, but if you search up his name on YouTube and this song, there is a high chance that you either know it or you have heard of it. Jimmy was performing at a nightclub in Wythenshawe called the Golden Garter, and Dorothy and her friends had managed to get right at the front. They spent the entire evening dancing the night away, having an amazing time, and at the end of the show, Jimmy wiped his sweaty forehead with a towel before throwing it into the crowd, and it would be Dorothy who excitedly managed to grab it and stuffed it into her bag. At the end of the night, all of the girls piled into a taxi and began to head home. As the taxi approached Piccadilly Gardens at around about 2:30 a.m, Dorothy decided to get out. She'd probably already been in the taxi for about half an hour from Wythenshawe to here. She and her friends lived in opposite directions, so she told them that she was going to jump out here, go to the bus station and just grab a night bus because it would be cheaper and she would save a little bit of money, so she would get herself home that way. But as the taxi pulled off and Dorothy waved off her friends, she didn't go into the bus stop. Instead, she began the almost 1 hour walk home, but she would never make it. A witness would recall seeing Dorothy distinct in her long blue coat walking up Rochdale Road, so she had got about halfway there. Terrifyingly, another witness either heard or saw Dorothy within an altercation arguing with a man, and it's believed that this man was her killer. The following morning, now the 25th of April 1971, a little girl was out walking with her mum behind where used to be the Spread Eagle pub on Rochdale Road when she would discover the body of Dorothy Leyden. She had blunt force injuries to her head. Her killer had struck her repeatedly with either a brick or a slab of concrete. Her bag was found beside her, the contents of which had been emptied all around her. Her purse was still there, which still had money in, and she was still wearing her necklace, so that would help police rule out robbery as a motive. Also, the towel that Jimmy Ruffin had thrown into the crowd that she caught was still found at the scene. It would be determined that Dorothy had been raped by her killer, and the investigators believed that the motive for her murder was a sexually driven one. An extensive investigation into what monster murdered Dorothy went underway. The news of the callous crime devastated not just the local community, but the entire of Manchester. Who could do something like this? Who could savagely murder a young girl? Investigators conducted door-to-door inquiries, going to over 4,000 houses and taken reports. They spoke to an additional 4,000 people. They put up roadblocks and people were forced to pull over and give their whereabouts on the evening of the murder and if they knew anything, but no one did. In an effort to try and jog some memories, police created big billboards, and I saw on one of the photos, stood alongside a billboard, they had a mannequin. The mannequin was dressed in the same clothes that Dorothy had on, and they put a wig that resembled her hair on it as well, hoping that seeing this mannequin would jog up some memories for some people and that it would stick out to someone, but they were wrong. No one came forward with any information. One of the first serious leads that they thought could have led them to something would come from an anonymous phone caller urging police to look into a local man, a man who was known for violence and that he had what looked like fresh scratch marks on him. This man was Trevor Hardy, also dubbed the Beast of Manchester, a serial killer that targeted young girls in the night. He bludgeoned 2 of his victims with bricks and had a sexual element to their crimes. Trevor would bite off a nipple from 2 of his 3 victims, mutilating their bodies. I did actually cover that case on my last podcast episode, so you may already know all that, but if you don't and you're interested, make sure to go and check it out. Trevor began his killing spree in 1974, so that's a couple of years after the murder of Dorothy. Strangely though, only 4 days before her murder, Trevor had just been released from prison after serving time for an assault charge. And the MO for Dorothy's murder was very similar to the murders that Trevor would go on to commit. When police spoke to him, he completely denied any involvement in Dorothy's murder whatsoever, and his mum actually gave him an alibi for the night. So there was nothing that the police could really do. There was no evidence implicating him, and they were only looking into him based off of an anonymous phone call. After the 3 murders that Trevor committed, the Leyden family, friends and community all truly believed that Trevor was responsible for Dorothy's murder, and to this day many people still hold that belief. Maybe by the end of this episode I will have changed your mind on that though. In 2004, 33 years later, Dorothy's sibling, her sister I believe it was, contacted the Greater Manchester Police and asked them if they would take another look into her older sister's now cold murder and re-examine the evidence. Their mother had sadly passed away by now, and as the siblings were kind of clearing everything out of the home, they came across a box which had lots of things to do with Dorothy inside, including photos and newspaper clippings. After reading through these, they noticed Trevor Hardy's name. Of course, by now in 2004, he had already committed all of the murders and was sat in prison, so the siblings thought, why not try and look at him again? And that is why she reached out to the police again. She later spoke in a Crime Watch episode which aired in 2008 and said that she couldn't understand how Trevor Hardy hadn't been named, arrested or prosecuted in connection with Dorothy's murder, and she hoped that if they examined the evidence again all of these years later with fresh eyes, better technology, the investigators might be able to find something, and her hunch was right. Cold case investigator Martin Bottomley reviewed press pictures that were taken at the scene of the crime. One of them showed a detective collecting evidence. This was described as, quote, material directly adjacent to Dorothy. When Martin went to look for it, and miraculously he actually found it 33 years after it had been collected and it had been stored. It was actually stored so well that they were able to send it off to the lab to see if they they could pull anything from it. Admittedly, hopes weren't high due to how old the evidence was, but the lab were able to obtain a complete DNA profile of Dorothy's killer. This was exciting news because surely someone who committed such a horrible crime would have gotten into some sort of trouble later in their life after committing the crime, who just commits one brutal murder and then does nothing ever again. If this was the case, this man would have been arrested and had his DNA put into the database, and all they had to do was input this new DNA that they found and then they would get a match. However, after uploading the DNA to the database, that is where their luck would run out because there were no matches, no direct matches, and not even a familial match. Whoever murdered Dorothy wasn't in the system. This meant that Trevor Hardy, who had been incarcerated several times throughout his entire life and was currently serving whole life orders, wasn't the killer. Martin personally obtained another sample of Trevor's DNA when he went into prison to speak to him, but still, it wasn't a match. Trevor wasn't the killer. Within the same Crime Watch episode that I mentioned earlier, Martin appealed to anyone who has any information to come forward. He reiterated that Trevor Hardy had nothing to do with it because maybe he thought that someone out there might have suspected someone that they knew, a friend, a boyfriend, husband or brother, but that they might have brushed off their suspicions when Trevor's name got brought up, thinking that Trevor was more a match for the crime than their cousin, for example. Dorothy's case was featured on another Crime Watch episode in 2016, and following this, investigators received 20 pieces of information, including 2 names which they described as being very excited about. And that is the final update that I could find surrounding Dorothy's murder. The man who killed Dorothy may still be alive today. It was theorized that he would have been in maybe his 20s or 30s in 1971, meaning that now he could be up to 80 years old. So there is the chance that he is still alive and there is still time for justice. I know 1971 wasn't yesterday, it was a little while ago, but just to try and help jog some memories, this is some information around about the time of Dorothy's murder. On the day that Dorothy's body was found, that also happened to be the census day, which doesn't happen often. So the investigators hope that maybe someone remembers something and remembers filling out the census forms. Of course, Motown star Jimmy Ruffin was in Manchester, that was quite big, and the news of Dorothy's murder was very big and widespread at the time. Hopefully that'll be able to jog someone's memory and someone can come forward with the final piece of information that investigators need to bring justice for Dorothy. If you have any information, no matter how small, please contact Manchester Police. Come forward and help get justice for Dorothy Leyden. Thank you so much for joining me for today's episode. Please make sure to follow the podcast wherever you're listening so that you'll be notified every time I upload a brand new true crime case, and follow me on Instagram at TrueCrimeCaitlyn where you'll find images relating to today's case. Thank you all again for tuning in and I will see you all on the next one.